He is a reporter and the author of Wembanyama, the story of Wemby's meteoric rise from those who knew him best. Welcome Yann Ohnona onto Hoopsology. Welcome, Yann.
Thank you for having me. How are you?
Doing pretty well. Thanks for joining the show. Really appreciate it. Before we hop into the book, we have a tradition on our show just because, along with delving into the mainstream headlines of basketball, we delve into basketball culture, what makes the game
hmm
of basketball so special. So, any way you want to take this question, what is your first or favorite basketball memory?
it's kind of linked to my age. I'm 45, so I grew up in the 90s. I first found out and became passionate about basketball just going to a friend's house in the country, and we watched a videotape of Michael Jordan's "Come Fly with Me," and we just spent just like the whole week just trying to do Michael Jordan's moves in the garden on a small hoop, and that's how it all started for me. And then just moving on, it's just hiding, getting in Europe we didn't have the game live, so we needed to get the videotapes, so we had to hide to watch it, to wake up at the middle of the night. So I'm right there in that era, and that's how I fell in love with basketball, with the 1996 and 1992 Chicago Bulls with Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and all.
So, you have a deep knowledge of the game of basketball abroad. Can you discuss that in relation to Victor Wembanyama and just his meteoric rise to this fame and prominence, and just how much he had an impact on the game of basketball at such an early age? And this, myself, as basketball fans in America, we were aware of him way before he was even stepping foot on the NBA court. So, from your perspective, kind of linking your fandom of Michael Jordan to when Victor Wembanyama first got on the radar, can you kind of talk about just that journey to how the international game has exploded, how it is now?
Yeah, kind of. You know what struck me when I first saw him like live? So it's important to state that there's a big difference between watching highlights of him, I mean, a few years ago, and just witnessing what he's doing on the court. When you see him move, when you see how he does, when you hear him talk, especially, you can see that it's different. So what I would say is, what I remember is when I was like a young journalist, which is already was 20 years ago, one of the first NBA games I was able to attend professionally, I ran into Shaquille O'Neal in a locker room, and I was like, whoa, that was the first time I saw such, a huge, just athlete, and such a legend. 15 or 20 years went by, and I still was shocked when I first met and when I first saw Wembanyama. And that's what made me understand that there was something special there, because with all the experience that I had, hundreds of games I've been attending and articles, I'm not surprised anymore. It's kind of sad sometimes, but you're not a fan anymore. You work. And so when I saw him, you see, right away that there's something different about him. And I'm talking about when he was playing his early days in Asvel. So he was injured. He was not yet like globally known. I mean, specialists would know about him, of course, for years, but general people wouldn't know him, and people would doubt him because he was injured, and they were all like, okay, he's gonna get injured. His body is not gonna fit for the NBA. It's not gonna work. Blah blah blah. And when I heard him talk, I understood that there was something different about him, not just on the court. And that's how I would put it.
So, in the book, you discuss this Wemby's passion to being great and just not just being an all star or just another pedestrian NBA player, but being one of the greatest of all time. Can you discuss where that competitive spirit comes from?
So first of all, he has an environment, a very protective and very good environment. So his father used to be a triple jumper, so he was an athlete. So he practiced a lot with Victor Wembanyama on track and field. So he did a lot of this. He says, Victor says that's how he learned how to run. And that's very important when you're that tall, to know how to use your feet and to know how to run, to not get injured, for example. And his mother used to be a basketball coach and a basketball player at a very good level, at a very high level. And so Victor was, going to the gym all the time with her. and she even coached him when he was a kid. And so the passion comes from here. But then, they never forced him to do anything. At least that's what he says. They never pressured him, and his whole family ended up playing basketball. The brother used to play handball in the same club as Victor in Nanterre, and then went to basketball. And his sister, of course, is also playing basketball. So he was a big fan of. I know he was talking about Kevin Durant, about Garnett, and about a lot of players that he was watching as a kid. But you know the passion just came with watching basketball games and playing basketball. And he always wanted to be different. He used to be a goalkeeper when he was a kid. He spent a few years playing soccer, and he was goalkeeper. There are a few images of this if you look it up online. It's interesting.
Can you discuss the pressure that he felt at such an early age? A lot of comparisons are made to LeBron James when he was in high school, and just the media pressure, his games being televised on ESPN before he ever got into the NBA. So for Victor, you mentioned in the book that he was discovered by scouts when he was 10 years old. Was he starting to feel the pressure? How did he deal with that? And also just being like he's a kid, just having a normal childhood. Like was there a balance there, or was he just strictly driven on this basketball journey?
So he never had like a normal childhood. That's the thing. So the pressure never really affected him. I think at that level today, it's impossible not to get influenced or not to get affected. But at his level, honestly, I saw him when he was like 17 or 16 with 50 reporters around him. And, he was smiling and laughing, making jokes, so he never was affected by this. And it's one of the most impressive things about him. And when he was very young, people around, he told me that he could read when he was like 3 years old. So, he was tall. So he never, had like a typical traditional childhood. So he always kind of felt different, and he always wanted to cultivate this difference. He always says, I want to be myself. That's why he related and liked the alien concept. But alien not in the sense of a monster, in the sense of something different, something that you don't know, but you want to find out about. And he likes that, and that became a brand actually of who he is in terms of personality and how he plays. At least that's how he wants to, put it. And about what you were saying when he was 10 years old. So one of the places I was able to visit was, the name is Bourbourg. It's a small village, a small town in the north of France. And when he was 10, he just joined Nanterre, which is the club that he grew in. They're hosting for the last 20 years a tournament, a so-called like world championship for under 11 kids. And so he went there when he was 10. And so what happens is that, Nanterre is a professional club in France. So you get scouts in the US that have relationships with a general manager in Nanterre or coaches in Nanterre. So of course, when Nanterre saw that kid, it was impossible to know what he would do, but for sure he had a special motivation. He was already so tall, and it was like this tall guy trying to play like a point guard. And coaches would tell him to go under the basket, and he was like, no, man, I want to dribble. I want to play like Iverson. I want to be a point guard. I want to shoot threes. And he wanted to be different in that way too. So you can actually say that when he was 10, I can tell you for a fact that some scouts in the US already knew about him when he was 10 years old. That tells you what era we are in right now. And when you were talking about, I think it's the coach of Nanterre who was telling me about Mike Schmitz being in the arena, but that was a few years later, but that was still early. And when you were talking about LeBron James, it's actually very different. I mean, LeBron James never experienced such a hype and such a buzz just because there weren't any social networks back then. I think he stated that himself. That's something unprecedented, what we witnessed with Victor Wembanyama during the draft. And the year before that, I think the number is more than 1 billion views or engagements in terms of social networks or anything about him in 2023. And try to remember that he started the NBA in October. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. It's really unprecedented.
No, I think you bring up an excellent point where now where Victor is living, there's so many more eyeballs all around the world where with LeBron very much like isolated only with America and only like certain bursts, like different American media outlets. Certainly a lot of pressure, but you're right. I mean, with Victor, it's a worldwide phenomenon, and I want to talk to you about that in terms of when he was drafted to the Spurs and with San Antonio having such a rich history of international players. What was his first year like, in your opinion, just in terms of him getting used to the league, him being by Coach Popovich, known as a tough coach, but a coach nevertheless has worked with a lot of international players. In your opinion, do you think the league kind of lived up to expectations for Victor from his own perspective in terms of him idolizing all these players? Like, how do you think he really appreciated kind of the NBA compared to, playing a whole different form of basketball overseas?
I think he really lived up to expectations. I mean, yeah, there might be a question about that maybe the first or third of the season, but I actually liked what I saw in a sense, in one sense. I heard a lot of criticism about Popovich, about the Spurs, and about how they were playing him. But I really found it interesting that Popovich, which obviously knew what he was doing, and decided along with the Spurs staff to, take some time and observe. I like that he just let him do whatever he wanted to do. And so there were a lot of mistakes. There were a lot of bad shots. There were a lot of, weird movements and where he should play, what position. And once you get enough observation, you say, okay, and now we're gonna do what's more efficient. But at least Victor could by himself, face difficulties and face stuff that he was not expecting. So I think that was more interesting that way. And then I understand. Then they moved him to to center, which made sense maybe from the start. But if he had not, gone through this period of time where he just has to test himself, what moves work, where he should be, what's the real physical challenge, he would not be so efficient on the second part of the season. And you can see that he started, passing the ball much more and really well. He became closer to his teammates. To me, that was obvious. At the beginning of the seasons, they had trouble giving him the ball sometimes. At the end of the season, they looked like, like good friends and trying to find each other much more. And he found his place. And then he really dominated. When I was there in January, I think there was still a debate between him and Chet Holmgren, for the Rookie of the Year. 1 month later, there was no discussion anymore, even though Chet had a huge season. So I think he lived up to expectation. So that's what's going to make the upcoming season even more interesting.
So, what do you think was Victor's biggest hurdle during his first year that kind of came from your perspective, out of nowhere, that you didn't anticipate that he had like struggles with during that first half of the season? Then he overcame it and really dominated towards the latter part of the season.
So I think that in general, the interviews that I did with Victor, he always pointed out the fact that he wanted to be a player that could do basically anything, find any solutions to any problem. So in the years that I've been watching him, I tend to think that he shoots too many threes. So I think that he's attracted to the three-point line, and sometimes I think it's too much. So but the thing is, he can do it, you know? So it's always about balance and about measure and about, when you should do it, how you should do it, when you should go inside, when you should use, that shooting ability to your advantage or your team advantage. And I think the biggest challenge for him has been to make his game simpler, I mean, and to choose when he can go and do all his dribbles and all of these things, because sometimes he did too much, too much dribbling, too much going outside. But at the same time, he can do it. That's what makes him special at the same time. So it's really, understanding when he should do that. And the fact that Popovich just told him, okay, go do your thing, made it more difficult. And he had the exact same process. in the French league with the Boulogne Metropolitans. They went to the finals, but at the beginning of the season, it was exactly the same. He was shooting too much from the outside, and little by little, he just one of the things with him is that he really absorbs everything around him, and every season he just keeps progressing, and his game changes for real. And it happens, actually, the same happens during the Olympics. We saw the same scheme, exactly the same. The same thing happened. I mean, between the first games and the elimination games, where he, stepped up and changed his game.
No, that's a really good point. You brought up the Olympics. Can you talk about that? Because despite France, not taking home the gold, he was pretty. I think a huge metamorphosis in his game, and it's very clear that Victor Wembanyama is going to be an MVP candidate, not only in the Olympic play but also the NBA fairly soon. So can you talk about just that jump, because that's a high pressure situation against a very stacked USA team, and he performed quite well and was pretty much the leader on that team. Can you kind of talk about, that dichotomy? Because it's just a huge jump immediately in terms of pressure, competition, and he performed quite well.
He did. I don't know how aware the US audience is about the Olympics. It's so different from regular season NBA type of games. Like, it's a very different type of pressure. It's much more physical.
Yeah.
Like, really much more physical. If we're talking about the playoffs, there's no question, of course, in terms of intensity. But when all the teams have to play 82 games, it's impossible to bring up, your A game every night. And when you come to the Olympics and to FIBA international play, this is really tough. It's really tough. I mean, going against Jokic, against all those guys, Antetokounmpo, but in a court that is smaller, with referees that whistle much less, so you get more contact. The paint is always crowded. You have a lot of defensive helps, so it's very different kind of pressure and different kind of game. And so it was a huge, huge leap, because he had never played at that level, actually. So Victor had a very weird tournament where in the first three games, to qualify for the quarterfinals, he had a lot of points and rebounds, so very big statistically, but he was not as efficient and productive as one would have expected. If you just look at the numbers, they were huge, but the whole team had issues trying to play a better basketball. And you had like the guards not being able to score like they used to, the inside players at the same time not being as efficient as they are. So to me, it was the same process. We saw Victor trying to find where he should stand in that team during those first three games, and just discovering that type of physicality and level. And even though the statistics were good, he was not playing the best basketball he could have. And sometimes it might have hurt the team in some ways. It's not that he wanted to, of course, but you could see that some players were, trying to find their rhythm. And it was all complicated, because when you put Victor Wembanyama in a team, he becomes instantly the most important player, and so you have to deal with that. You have to learn how to play with him, to learn how for him to be efficient and the other to find their role. And then when it came to the quarterfinals and the semifinals, Victor had I think something like 1 of 13 3-point shots between the two games, but he was huge in defense against Canada, and then against Germany, who were the world champion. He was just outstanding, blocking everything, making everything difficult for anybody who would try to go inside the paint. And France had a big adjustment. They moved Victor to the 5. He was playing at the 4 position until then, and it changed everything. So it kind of looks like what happened with the Spurs. And in the end, he was completely freed by the change of tactics. And against the USA in the final, he had 26 points. But I have to say that USA's defense was not that good. I mean, compared to other teams that we had faced before, they were not at the top of what they can do.
Yeah,
so
no.
He had more spaces.
Totally agree. Yeah, pretty subpar So, what is your expectations for Victor in his second year? Now that he's gotten somewhat acclimated just to the league, higher expectations. Where do you see him performing kind of in his second year in the league? And also, a follow up question to that. We've seen a lot of rookies typically, if the team is not performing, them wanting to go somewhere else. Do you think Victor, to the best of your estimation, sees a long term home in San Antonio and is willing to be patient in terms of seeing this team grow around him into a natural contender down the line?
So of course I cannot talk for Victor Wembanyama, but what I can say from all the discussions that I had with him is that he does not sound like the type of player who would just leave like that. I don't think so. But then he's a competitor, so like everyone, if things don't move, of course, at one point he will have to, wander. But I don't think that's where he is right now. So for his second season, we can only expect the unexpected because even with a weird kind of average, not average, but the first half of the season last year was not that, good because a lot of losses for the Spurs and Victor Wembanyama trying to find himself. I mean, he now he knows what to expect. Now he has, that guy Chris Paul right next to him. So Stephen Castle is intriguing, but interesting. Harrison Barnes, so they have more experience, they have more, playmaking. So what can I say? If he goes 20 and 10 his first season, without all the experienced players around him, now he comes out stronger with better players and better supporting cast. I mean, it's gonna be like 25 and 15, or it's gonna be like 28. I don't know. I'm not sure, but for sure the Spurs are gonna, win more games. I think that's not a question. The real question is, are they in the mix for the play-in comes February, and that's what's interesting.
Yeah. No doubt. Final question I have for you. What is one surprising thing that people don't know about Victor that is a unique fact about him that people wouldn't expect about his personality or could be about his game or his family life or his hobbies? Something that really surprised you just when talking to him and just your research as well.
So one of the first time I sat with him for a long time, it was in Lyon a few years ago. When I got into his living room, he had that big painting. It's a painting from an artist called Ruben Gerard, a very interesting painting. It was a basketball player, and it rang a bell. I mean, it did something to me because it reminded me of like Boys in the Hood and
Mm-hmm.
these kind of movies, and Spike Lee movies and stuff like that. It was that kind of vibe, hip hop 90s. And I was just like, okay, Victor, you just settled in Villeurbanne, in Lyon. So where does that painting come from and why that painting? And I was expecting, so he just turned 18 at that moment. And I was expecting something like, I just got it because it was cool. I saw it on Instagram or blah, 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 or my parents got it for me. And I didn't know him at that moment, not yet. And the answer was like, look, and he read my mind. Like I didn't say anything. And he was like, it reminded me of the Spike Lee movies in the 90s, and I like the vibe, the hip hop thing, and I like the way the artist painted it because he studied every inch of the painting. That's what he said. He's 18. And so you should know that Victor Wembanyama is much, I think your people already know, but he's into drawing. He draws a lot. He spends a lot of his free time drawing characters. He loves heroic fantasy literature. He's a big fan of Brandon Sanderson, for example, but not only. So he loves any activity that will activate he loves Lego. So anything that will activate his hands and at the same time his mind. And he loves to draw. So he loves graphic art and stuff like that. And so I was really not expecting this from, a teenager. And that shows his dedication to anything that he does. It was not just a random painting picked up on Instagram because it looked cool and had good colors. So it really meant something to him. And I like that because that translates it in his game. That's what he tries to do with his game. He tries to make it some kind of an art and something that you didn't see before.
No, that's totally true. Jan, thank you very much for spending some time with us. Can you please let our audience know where they can find you on social media, upcoming projects? Please let our audience know where they can find the book. And thank you very much for joining us once again.
Sure. So the book that I did about Victor Wembanyama is about everything that he did before he got into the NBA, and you can find that on Amazon. And there's a whole part about the draft because I was lucky to be there, like really close to him and his family and his agents. Thanks to his agents and thanks to his family to let us, be around, not all the time, but really often. We were able to, to do some pictures and stuff like that. We were in the stadium, in the Yankee Stadium when he was there, in the subway in New York, in San Antonio when their plane landed. It was really a terrific experience. It was actually a once in a lifetime experience for me too, like as a reporter. So I really thank all of his staff and his entourage because they were very kind to us. And so you can find the book on Amazon, on Instagram. My name is Yann Ohnona, Yohnona. You can find me on social media with that nickname.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.